If any portion of the Western Roman Empire deserves to be thought of as belonging to the Dark Ages, it's the British Isles. What we know for certain is that the Roman legions pulled out of the province of Roman Britain in about 410. Probably, anyway, there are some problems concerning that date, and we know that the territory kept in some sort of contact with the Roman Empire for at least a few more decades. The exact time frame will depend on which professional historian or archaeologist you ask, but for something like 200 to 300 years, our sources for post-Roman Britain consist of two main texts. A three-part sermon written by a monk, Gildas, around the early 6th century, and the writings of the monk Bede in the late 720s and the 730s. Neither of these people were historians. Gildas was a priest attempting to explain the situation that the Romano-British found themselves in, which he blamed pretty heavily on a combination of their own actions and sin, and Bede was writing a history of the church in Britain. Aside from this, we have some Welsh poetry, often from the 11th and the 12th centuries, but which contain manuscripts which were originally, at least in part, from the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. From this, we learn of migration from the continent, the establishment of kingdoms, and hints of a battle named Badon, and of a man called Ambrosius, and of another man called Arthries. Aside from this, we have an ever-increasing amount of archaeology, now being augmented by information about genetics, ancient diseases, isotopic studies, and osteology derived from the hard sciences. In many cases, it's difficult to match up archaeology to the few texts that we have, and in some cases this doesn't work. So in trying to answer a question like what happened to Hadrian's Wall after the Romans left Britain is going to be based on solid evidence and a degree of educated speculation. And as a result, this video is going to be rather short. So, what can we actually say about this? In what is today Scotland, where the Romans had only a marginal presence based around structures like the Antonine Wall, the Roman sites turn up no presence of habitation in the post-Roman period. But, along Hadrian's Wall, farther to the south, we have at least 8 forts which show evidence of continued use into the 5th and 6th centuries, and of one which shows evidence of habitation into the 9th. 2 of those sites, Housesteads and Chesterholm, also show evidence of refortification, while at least one of the other forts along the wall, and several towns to the south of the wall, have material evidence consistent with that found in Central Europe. These 8 forts and the 3 major towns, especially Carlisle, were part of the military zone called the Dux Britanniarum, which means that this entire military zone was, to a degree, still occupied. That's what we officially know for certain, and as we keep digging, it's extremely probable that that information will expand, especially as archaeologists specifically look for evidence from the 5th and the 6th centuries. In the past, the slight traces of occupation that may or may not have been there were dismissed due to the general decline of things like masonry, but as recent excavations have shown, that's not always the case. The thornier problems concern chronology and properly interpreting the non-Roman and the non-British archaeology. What are we to make of the Central European materials? We don't know exactly when all of this evidence is supposed to line up. Should they all be placed across the 5th and the 6th, maybe into the 7th centuries? Or closer together, not over a 200 or 300 year period, but maybe slightly over 100. Many sites in post-Roman Britain show evidence of some sort of a Christian presence, such as churches or graves, but the sites along the wall don't really show signs of this. The prevailing interpretation, then, is that all of these sites are of a secular nature, but then the interpretation splits into 2 different, although not necessarily exclusive, views. The first view is that these sites represent something rather unique, in part because some of the material suggests at least some sort of a high-status presence, and because there don't appear to be sites like this in such a cluster elsewhere in the British Isles. The other view is to look at the occupation and the archaeology, and to conclude that it was Anglo-Saxons who lived here, not Romano-British. These are not incompatible views, and actually a mixed perspective is very likely to be the correct one. So, how did these people from Central Europe get to Britain? This is a whole area of study in and of itself, and it's one which is rapidly changing. Our evidence and conclusions from 2020 are not the same from 2010, for example. It progresses that quickly, so what I'm going to try and do here is summarize a lot of information into about a paragraph. Mass population movement to the British Isles from Central Europe, but especially from the North Sea coast of what is today Germany and Denmark, is unquestionable. At one time, especially during the 19th century, it was thought that the people who became the Anglo-Saxons picked up stakes and essentially moved all at once. Using a combination of texts, archaeology, DNA, isotope analysis, climatology, and modern migration studies, we now know that this was much more complex. The late Roman army often employed barbarians as federate troops. Usually they were allowed to settle somewhere in the empire in exchange for service. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, we have a new term showing up for southern Britain and part of the Gallic coast, the Saxon Shore, which denotes an area which suffered raiding by a Central European people known as the Saxons. And this military zone had forts, known as the Saxon Shore forts. We do know that some people from the North Sea coast of continental Europe served in the Roman army in Britain, so already in the 3rd century there was some movement. Between the 4th and the 7th centuries this increases. Genes by themselves don't necessarily prove this, but genes combined with isotopic analysis of teeth can better inform us about population movements, and it looks like more and more people were coming over. Now, why were they doing this? On the one hand, some of those soldiers would have had family back across the sea, and when the Roman army pulled out, maybe some of them stayed, and their commanders needed more troops. Maybe they invited sons, cousins, or nephews, maybe some of those people refused, but word spread. There was also evidence from climatology and sediment analysis that the North Sea was flooding some coastal areas, so that's another factor. There is, of course, the famous story of Saxons being invited over. Some of them likely would have just wanted to engage in raiding. And once these people landed in Britain, well, the older idea was that there was a mass population replacement through warfare. Newer interpretations talk about elite replacement by newcomers and by the willful adoption of Germanic culture by Romano-Britons. Probably all three of these situations happened at one point or another. The evidence also indicates that the populations came over not all at once, but in waves, with some of that evidence pointing to a slowdown of migration between about 500 and about 550, around the time that the Battle of Badon, when Arthur defeated an invading Saxon army, is supposed to have taken place. My overall point is that this is a complex series of interlinked processes and not a singular event, with a lot of moving parts. The British economy collapsed pretty soon after the Romans withdrew, and by the middle of the 6th century, things had started to come back, but the material culture looked very different. Aqueducts had fallen into disrepair, people often lived in wooden houses and timbered halls, and the population began to be drawn from a mixture of native Romano-British, newcomers from the east, so the Germans, and newcomers from the west and the north, the Irish and the Picts. So, back to the wall. In the absence of any sort of centralized command, it's very likely that locals would have looked to the army for defense. Given that the period of time we're looking at for these sites show what appears to be both Romano-British and Germanic archaeology side by side, it is not impossible to theorize that perhaps what we're looking at here is the remains of a portion of the garrison, which included Angles, Saxons, and others, and maybe, in time, due to the absence of centralized authority, one of those commanders began to consider himself a king, or maybe something like it. The defenses which were rebuilt in this period all faced north, and while we don't know for certain if Pictish raids continued into this period, although we might imagine that they did, we do have scattered references of some sort of polity in this area around the wall and to the south. And we have recent confirmation of a kingdom, Gododin, to the north, which might explain the refortification. In any case, one of the working hypotheses concerning all of this is that, whatever the specifics of the situation, the wall functioned as a dividing line in the area and as a power base. Possibly the most important suggestion here is that because many of the forts retain the name Chester or Castor, a term coming from the Latin word for fort, which thus implies that the Anglo-Saxons continued to recognize these areas as Roman places, and therefore it is perhaps not all that surprising to find the wall mentioned in the writings of Gildas, because it was in use right up until his own time, and perhaps after as well. No one knows for certain if Arthur was real, but if he was, this was his world, and the wall continued to function in this one, just as it had when Britain was Roman.